Hi, everyone.
Hello, folks. We're doing Genesis again. We haven't been in Genesis for some months. We took an extended hiatus while we were planning and executing the move. But we did want to go back to the series because if you've seen any of the prior videos, you realize they started by a testimony from both of us as to how this book changed our viewpoints on a great number of things. But the most important things, God, the doctrine of man, the doctrine of salvation, how are we saved, and especially the doctrine of grace, that we could see the outstanding lesson of the whole book of Genesis was God's grace. That is, it's about His faithfulness and not about ours. And that reorients you completely if you're a Jehovah's Witness. So we did want to dive back into Genesis. We left off in chapter 18, and this chapter, maybe more than any other chapter, is responsible for our rethinking our points of view, especially about God. And if you remember the story so far, we left off at verse 15. And verse 14 was the theme of the last study we did in Genesis, which was, is anything too extraordinary or impossible for Jehovah?
And that was because in the account, Sarah laughs when God says, when He returns, she's going to have a son. And she's not in the group. She's in the tent listening. And yet He knows what she was thinking, and she limits God. So I could see myself there, because I was limiting God. I was saying there were things that were too extraordinary for God. I had too small a God.
So if you don't recall the story, read over the first 15 verses and watch the last video. We'll put a link to it. But suffice it to say for now that 3 men have appeared to Abraham. He is entertaining them. He's offered to wash their feet and to feed them. We don't know if he actually got around to washing their feet. It doesn't say so explicitly, but that's normal hospitality. But if so, he washes Jehovah's feet.
But they do eat. That's in there.
All of the men eat, and all of them are talking, and one of them is being addressed as Jehovah. And that being, Jehovah, appearing as a man, is telling Abraham and Sarah things that only God would know. One being that, well, your wife just laughed and she denies it, but He knows what she was thinking, whether she said it out loud or not. We don't know how loud she said it, but she denies it.
And even the fact that He recognizes one of them as Jehovah.
Why is that?
Because he'd had experiences like this before.
Apparently with just one man appearing to him.
Yeah.
Starting with the one back in chapter 12, where the 7 promises that constitute the Abrahamic covenant at that point are first laid before Abraham. And another thing that demonstrates this man in front of him is omniscient is that he says this time next year she will have a baby. So he not only knows the future, but he demonstrates not only omniscience but omnipotence, because who but God could arrange for a barren woman to have a baby at the age of 90? Now later in this account, when we get to Sodom and Gomorrah, we discuss the other attribute, classical attribute of God, not just His omniscience and His omnipotence, but His omnipresence. But we won't get into that quite yet. The bottom line, though, verse 14 again, is anything too hard for Jehovah? And we pick up the tale in verse 16, Genesis 18, verse 16.
Okay. Later, the men got up from there and looked down towards Sodom, and Abraham was walking with them to escort them. And Jehovah said, Am I keeping covered from Abraham what I am doing? Why, Abraham is surely going to become a nation, great and mighty, and all the nations of the earth must bless themselves by means of him. For I have become acquainted with him, in order that he may command his sons and his household after him, so that they shall keep Jehovah's way, to do righteousness and judgment, in order that Jehovah may certainly bring upon Abraham what he has spoken about him. Consequently, Jehovah said, "The cry of complaint about Sodom and Gomorrah, yes, it is loud, and their sin, yes, it is very heavy. I am quite determined to go down, that I may see whether they act altogether according to the outcry over it that has come to me, and if not, I can get to know it." At this point, the men turned from there and got on their way to Sodom. But as for Jehovah, he was still standing before Abraham. Then Abraham approached and began to say, "Will you really sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous men in the midst of the city. Will you then sweep them away and not pardon the place for the sake of the 50 righteous who are inside it? It is unthinkable of you that you are acting in this manner, to put to death the righteous man with the wicked one, so that it has to occur with the righteous man as it does with the wicked. It is unthinkable of you. Is the judge of all the earth not going to do what is right?" Then Jehovah said, "If I shall find in Sodom 50 righteous men in the midst of the city, I will pardon the whole place on their account." But Abraham went on to answer and say, "Please, here I have taken upon myself to speak to Jehovah, whereas I am dust and ashes. Suppose the 50 righteous should be lacking 5. Will you for the 5 bring the whole city to ruin?" To this he said, "I shall not bring it to ruin if I find there 45. But yet again he spoke further to him and said, "Suppose 40 are found there." In turn he said, "I shall not do it on account of the 40. But he continued, "May Jehovah please not grow hot with anger, but let me go on speaking. Suppose 30 are found there." In turn he said, "I shall not do it if I find 30 there." But he continued on, "Please, here I have taken upon myself to speak to Jehovah. Suppose 20 are found there." In turn he said, "I shall not bring it to ruin on account of the 20. Finally he said, "May Jehovah please not grow hot with anger, but let me speak just this once. Suppose 10 are found there." In turn he said, "I shall not bring it to ruin on account of the 10. Then Jehovah went his way when he had finished speaking to Abraham. And Abraham returned to his place.
Much to say. Start with verse 16. The men got up to leave. Again, these 3 individuals, including Jehovah, are spoken of as men. And they walk. And as later we see, one of them, the one remaining behind, the third, negotiates. Or better to say, Abraham negotiates with him. But in verse 17, you have an indication of the status of a prophet, even though the word prophet's not used here. Here's the first definition in the Bible of what a prophet will be, because later, a couple of chapters from now, still in Genesis, Abraham is actually called a prophet. We don't normally think of him that way, but here's what a prophet is according to the revelation of Jehovah. "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do?" So these are the ones, as it were, Jeremiah puts it this way, that are brought into the intimate circle of Jehovah and his plans. "He will become a powerful nation, a great and powerful nation, and all nations of the earth will be blessed through him." A reiteration of the Abrahamic covenant in chapter 12. But here's a big distinction if you're in the Watchtower. What does the New World Translation do with verse 19?
It says, "For I have become acquainted with him, in order that he may command his sons and his household after him."
Well, with that choice of verb, acquainted with, it's almost as if he looks around and finds someone who's suitable to his purpose and says, well, I can use him. But The NIV, for among other Bibles, says, "I have chosen him." The impetus and the salvation process starts with God electing. That's the technical word that Christians usually use for this. God chooses. Just as Christ says to the apostles in John, the Last Supper account, he says, "You did not choose me, I chose you." And if God chooses a man, he then not only appoints him, but he equips him.
Yeah, there's a purpose behind it. So
And
you
it's stated
see
here.
that too in 19, that they shall keep Jehovah's way to do righteousness and judgment.
That the Lord, Jehovah, will bring about for Abraham what he's promised. So in that one verse you have leaping over several thousand years of history. From the creation of a great nation and that the first child hasn't been born yet, to the blessing of all nations through this nation that is from Abraham's seed.
And I think you commented on the fact, it says here, Jehovah's way, and the early church, that's what they were known as, the way.
The way.
You know, so it's the walk, it's the way people live that was kind of highlighted.
Keeping his commandments. So the early church was not called Christian. That was a word apparently attached to them by outsiders looking on. But they were called among themselves the way, in fulfillment of this. So you leap over 2,000 plus years of history right there to see, again, God demonstrating his omniscience, that is, that he's all-knowing, and his omnipotence at the same time, because who can bring this all about except God? And then another demonstration of his omniscience in verse 20. Jehovah says, "The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin so grievous." So despite outward appearances, God knows what's going on in Sodom. He hasn't had to go down there. But you can get the impression that he doesn't know from, if you just have verse 21.
Yeah. "I am quite determined to go down, that I may see whether they act altogether according to the outcry over it that has come to me. And if not, I can get to know it." But I was thinking when we were talking about this, that there's lots of occasions where God asks questions of people, and you would think, well, doesn't he know?
For instance, Cain.
Cain, right, like, where's your brother? But he demonstrated later, because Cain doesn't fess up, that he does know. He says, his blood is crying out to me. So he's knowing, but he does give opportunity for the ones he's speaking to. He's more or less condescending to their level.
In a nice way.
Yeah, so that they are, talking with him, familiar with him, and it gives them the opportunity to fess up.
Like we do with children?
Yeah.
Well, even in this chapter, you might remember just back in verse 9, Jehovah asked Abram, "Where's your wife?"
Yeah.
Does God not know where she is, really?
Yeah.
So, in verse 22, again, how does it read in the New World Translation there?
At this point, the men turned from there and got on their way to Sodom. But as for Jehovah, he was still standing before Abraham.
Now, you might not notice this when you're a witness. That means that when we get to the Sodom part of the story, you're going to find two men, and indeed you do.
Yeah.
There's two men who are also called angels in that same chapter.
And men.
And men in the same chapter. But Abraham, NIV says, remained standing before Jehovah, but the New World Translation turns that one around, right? Jehovah is standing
before
Abraham. Do we take that seriously?
No.
Verse 23, then Abraham approached. I think the New World Translation leaves it with the verb, right?
Which verse again?
Verse 23. Abraham approached him, NIV says here.
Yeah.
Will you sweep away the righteous? And then the negotiation goes on. But I think you can see just from the way the negotiation proceeds that because God is actually there in front of him, there's a certain familiarity that breeds.
It's a conversation. It's more of a conversation. If he was speaking to the sky, to the
voice out of the heavens.
you would either be very intimidated. I think I'd be intimidated if it was a voice out of the sky speaking to me. But here, there is a and he's eaten a meal and been in their presence while they were eating. There is a feeling of guard being dropped. He's very respectful of God, but he's able to speak to him as one man speaks to another.
Yes, so God getting too close breeds familiarity, and we might want to make the point that the Jews, the rabbis that is, in between the two testaments, felt this was not good. So as the Watchtower, you might observe, renders all of the references to God, well, not all, but almost all of the references to God here as Jehovah. But if you have the New World Translation Reference Bible, you realize that there's a star beside the uses of Jehovah, which admit in the footnote that this is again the Sopharim have substituted the name Lord here, or the title Lord, Adonai, for the name Jehovah in these spots, because apparently they were showing mistaken reverence. This is the way the Watchtower frames it. That's the way
they frame it, yeah. But it may also be just that they were uncomfortable with the idea of God on the earth too.
Yes.
At that point.
There's very many manifestations of that if you know the Septuagint translation in Greek. Lots of times in the Septuagint these kind of references that are too familiar about Jehovah are somehow weakened or softened.
Softened, yeah.
I don't think we should leave it again, though, without the capper, verse 33. When Jehovah had finished speaking with Abraham, he left. So just as Jehovah walks into the story at the beginning, he walks out of it. Yeah. Literally.
Doesn't just disappear. Poof.
Yeah. And I think you want to make a point about John 1:18.
Yeah, because what will happen if you're talking to a witness is they'll say, well, it's impossible. And they'll use John 1:18. No one can see God.
Well, it actually says no one has seen God at any time. But of course the sentence doesn't end there.
Yeah. What does the rest say?
The only begotten God is the one who has explained him. The only begotten God who is in the bosom of the Father, not God, the Father.
That's a new translation too.
That's the New World Translation.
Has explained him.
So it's good that we've got the numbers in the inverse. If they give you a problem about Jehovah appearing and they use John 1:18, refer them to Genesis 18:1.
Yeah, so it's a nice symmetry there for you to remember it.
Yeah.
They'll use John 1:18. You can show them Genesis 18:1, where Jehovah appears.
Again.
Yeah.
So in the next segment, the angels get to Sodom, and more interesting verses that you might not notice as a witness about the attributes of Jehovah.